Okay, so let's jump out of that. We'll jump back live in a minute, but I really want to analyze the meat of this case. And now, joining us, we're so lucky, even though she's not in studio, but we'll get her any which way we can get her. Law and crime trial analyst, Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, good morning to you.
Good morning. I'm the lucky one, Jesse.
I like that. I'll take that. Now, we watched that video. We watched the body cam footage. Break it down for us. Is the standard what was going on in the mind of Roy Oliver? Because we saw the perspective of Officer Gross trying to stop the car that Jordan Edwards was in. It was driving away. He tried to smash the back window. But if you're looking at it from Roy Oliver's perspective, he said that there was a threat and thought the car was going to run over his partner, even though his partner said, I wasn't in fear for my life, and the car was going in the opposite direction. So what's the standard? Are we trying to get into the mind of Roy Oliver?
Well, the standard is almost always reasonableness, right? Because you could say anything. You could say you had a belief about anything. But if an objective juror can't understand that that belief was reasonable, then it's not going to fly in terms of giving you a defense. And I just want to back up for one quick second, Jesse, because earlier this week, you and I talked about another case where two officers made a routine traffic stop and they both got shot at. One of them got hit, right? You have to, so police officers are up against it every day in seemingly innocuous situations like pulling somebody over. Here you have cops responding to a party. You've got the belief of one officer who's now being charged for murder for doing what he's going to claim is his job. It's really difficult to get inside the mind of this officer.
Okay, but what are we? How is the jury supposed to look at this? Are they supposed to say, listen, let me think about what a reasonable person would have done, and under the circumstances, let's talk about the circumstances. The officers just heard gunshots. For some reason, Officer Gross wanted that car to stop. He starts banging on the window, and the car is speeding off. Now, it's not speeding in his direction. We know later that there's nobody in the car with weapons. No gunfire was coming from the car. So what is a reasonable person supposed to do in that circumstance? Do they see a threat, or were they just trigger happy?
Well, so you're making a great prosecutorial argument right now. And I don't know if in this case the defendant plans to actually testify to talk about, from his perspective, what was going on. Now, we know, generally speaking, his belief, or the belief that he's claiming, is that this car was going to back over his partner. We know that a car is a deadly weapon. We know that they were responding to some sort of trouble. Will that be enough to convince a jury that he had a reasonable belief of imminent bodily injury or death?
And that's the theory. I can watch this video and try to dissect it multiple times, and our viewers are looking at this right now. That is the exact moment when Roy Oliver fired his rifle into that car, and trying to understand what happened. And I got to ask your perspective. The defense didn't put on an opening statement. Why do you think so?
Well, they could be waiting. Sometimes the defense will wait and put on an opening statement until they actually open their case in chief, because this way they can incorporate what's occurred during the prosecution's case in chief. They might not. They want to wait until a different theory perhaps comes out during the prosecution's case in chief. Case in chief. That was a Freudian slip. So perhaps that's what they're waiting for, because we know this case, the defense team has been trying not to come forward with this case, trying to delay this case. They've been fighting this case every step of the way, because as we now know, there are statements that the prosecution wants to bring in that the defense camp is saying, wait a minute, this is unfair. These statements should not be coming in.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. I think we're back in our feed in Oliver right now, and let's show it if we can, because we're going to go live. This is, again, I think it's still Detective Billy Fetter from the Dallas Sheriff's Department. This Castigar hearing is still going on. The court is trying to decide, does the prosecution have enough evidence to go forward, or is there evidence based upon all protected statements? If so, that's not really much of a case. Let's find out. This down. Let's bring back in Jonna Spilbor. This is a big moment for the prosecution, right? Now, the way that I understand this is that the officer, the defendant in this case, provided statements that he had to make to Internal Affairs. He had no choice but to make those statements. But he has a right against self-incrimination. So is it that the prosecution has to make sure their case is built upon statements that go beyond what he said? And are they able to do it? What's going on here?
All right, so let's look at it like this, because this is fascinating to me. I'm looking at the Garrity warning, which is the warning that this officer got that basically compelled him to give information internal that was going to be used internally in the course of this investigation because he's a law enforcement officer. Think of the Garrity warning as the opposite of a Miranda warning, right? So a Garrity warning compels an officer to give testimony that a Miranda warning would compel you to not give. So if Miranda says, shut up, you have the right to remain silent, everything you say can and will be used against you, the Garrity warning is exactly the opposite of that. It says you have to talk to us, and these statements will not be used against you in a court of law, but they could be used against you in an administrative proceeding. So you can imagine the defense attorney can make a ton of hay with this, because this officer gave a lot of statements in the course of that investigation that he was compelled to, that the law says cannot be used against him. How much of those statements has the jury heard? Why are we're having a hearing in the middle of a trial, which is also unusual.
And correct me if I'm wrong, anything that flowed from those statements that led the prosecution to build their case, that can also not be used here, right?
Well, that's the theory. So you can see where a judge is going to have to, like, choppily find this. How much of those statements is an offshoot of what was said after a Garrity warning, and how much of that is fair game? That's the crux of the issue here.
I know, and the defense is literally whittling down the testimony of each of these witnesses to things that were said and done by Oliver to everything after he was given this warning. So this is a fascinating situation. I'm not sure what the result will ultimately be in terms of the prosecution's case. Maybe it'll really hurt it, and maybe they'll, who knows? We'll have to see. We're going to take a quick break on our end, and when we come back, hopefully we have a later development in Oliver. So stand by. We'll be back here on Law and Crime. This is fascinating, something we've never covered here on Law and Crime, a prosecution's case potentially falling apart like a house of cards. Let's bring back on Jonna Spilbor to talk about it. So, if they really can't build a case beyond what's already come into evidence, which is the body cam footage of Officer Gross and the testimony of Officer Gross, can they secure conviction for murder against Officer Roy Oliver?
You know, it's probably going to be much tougher. And it begs the question for me, Jesse, as I'm listening to this hearing go on, I'm saying to myself, is this defendant going to testify? Because in this case, it would probably be a really bad idea. Would that then open the door, like we're going through this tremendous hearing, would that open the door for some of the statements that could get suppressed to come on back in? So I think in a case like this ruling is critical, and then the decision whether or not to have your client testify is monumental.
And this is an interesting scenario because it's about an officer who had to speak to internal affairs. He had to give those statements. Those statements are necessarily protected. It's very different. As Jonna said, when you have a Miranda warning and you said, listen, anything you say or do can be used against you in a court of law. Here he's saying it's giving them an opportunity to speak to internal affairs and know that those statements won't be used against him in a courtroom. So this is fascinating, very unique. We're not even sure which way it's going to go. We'll take a quick break. We'll be back here on Law and Crime. Wow, this is really fascinating. I want to bring back on Jonna Spilbor to talk about this. So if this was inappropriate, Jonna, for the state to do, if they built their case in the wrong way, what was the right way to do it? This is not the first police shooting, and this is not the first time an officer has to speak to IA. What would they have needed to do properly here in order to build a case?
Well, they would have to go completely outside the statements made by this defendant, this officer, once that Garrity warning was given. And if this officer was smart, he would have asked for that Garrity warning almost immediately. Because look, Jesse, why are we even here? Why are we in this trial? I'll tell you why. Because an unarmed 15-year-old kid was shot down by an officer who was investigating an underage party, right? We have a problem with that as a society. The officers shouldn't be killing unarmed teenagers. And so I think in an abundance of caution, the state brought murder charges, the highest charge they could bring against an officer who went to work that day and now is finding himself at a defense table. This is a heartbreaking case all the way around. But procedurally, we were looking at a trial within a trial to determine which of these statements the prosecution is trying to bring into evidence to prove its case. Therein lies the rub. This is a critical hearing in this case.
And what's really, you can't help but think about what the Edwards family is thinking. They're sitting there, and this is a confusing thing for me, and I hope, I'm trying to make it a little bit clear for our viewers, but this is really confusing. What do you think they're thinking if, the whole state against the whole case brought by the state against the man who killed their son or their relative, what are they thinking right now? How did this happen?
Of course, they want justice in this case, and we have to determine what justice means. I mean, what we don't know right now, Jesse, not really, is what exactly this officer said after his Garrity warnings that is incriminating. He could have said an awful lot that actually may be helpful, and I'm sure he must have said things that are not helpful, or we wouldn't be having this hearing right now. But when you just look at the physical evidence, this is still a tough case. Shooting at a car that's not coming toward you is a problem for this police officer.
And let's listen in, and maybe we can learn a little bit more about these statements. Let's go live. Going on in Texas right now. I'm here with Jonna Spilbor. Now the prosecution has been asking for a private conference with the judge, and they said this is really worth your time. Jonna, you're the expert. What's going on?
I wish I knew. I'm not laughing. This is a serious case. But for the prosecutor to try to convince the judge that having an in-camera and in-chambers conference is, quote, not a waste of his time, tells me that perhaps this judge thinks that some of what's going on right now is a waste of his time, number one. Number two, you know what I was thinking about during this testimony, Jesse, which adds another element of sadness to this case, is that even if this officer's claim is he was afraid for the life of his partner because a car was backing into him, even though the physical evidence doesn't really show that, we got to remember that the victim in this case was not driving that vehicle. The victim in that case was simply a passenger in the vehicle, which just adds like another layer of sadness to what's going on here.
And I'm glad we're showing the courtroom feed, because we're talking about the legal implications and what this means. But you're watching the family members and people that knew this young man, Jordan Edwards, 15 years old, taken way too early, taken in the prime of his life, trying to understand, is the state going to be able to keep going on with this case? I mean, that's the practical implication of this. But if that's the case, and they really don't have much more to show, what have they presented so far to the jury? That brings me to where I want to take you right now. We saw the body cam footage of Officer Gross right when the shooting took place, right before the shooting, right when they heard. So they would show up to this house party. They start gathering everyone together. Then they hear these gunshots at a nearby nursing home. They run out. They try to stop the car where Jordan Edwards is, and that is when Officer Oliver opens fire. Let's show this video, because this is what the jury saw, and this may be what the prosecution builds their entire case on. Take a look. We got to get the reaction right now of Jonna Spilbor to that video. I'm struck by the term, when the phrase, he was going to hit you, not, oh, I thought he was going to hit you. Was he going to hit you? Almost telling Officer Gross, oh, he was going to hit you. I had to fire that weapon. Do you get the same reaction, or am I looking at it differently?
I'm going to give this defendant the benefit of the doubt and say that in his mind, that's probably what he thought. But look at the rest of what's going on here, Jesse. Everything's, they're investigating a house party when all of a sudden, fire, gunshots break out, and you heard the chaos, the screaming, the kids running, all this chaos. And for some reason, the officers focused on this car. Stop that car, stop that car. In his mind, he's an officer. Did he think perhaps that a car that's leaving the scene is responsible for these gunshots, and he's just trying to do his job in the midst of this chaos? If I were his defense attorney, that is the scenario I would be portraying to the jury.
And in his defense, there was a reason that Officer Gross, what was the reason that Officer Gross wanted to stop that car. There were a lot of people were leaving that he wanted to stop that car. So if you are Officer Oliver and your partner is trying to chase down this car after just hearing the gunshots, you may presume that the gunshots happened from there. It's a difficult case all which way you put it. I want to play the testimony, though, of Officer Gross about whether or not he felt there was a threat to his life. Take a look. Seems like a beatdown for the defense. They had tried to bring up several motions and they were denied by the judge. Basically, it all became a part of whether or not there was tainted testimony because this man, Roy Oliver, presented statements to Internal Affairs, and those were protected statements. The defense was trying every which way, evidentiary motions, recusal motions, dismissal motions, every which way to get this evidence out and hurt the prosecution's case. But, as you just heard, the judge denied it. Let's find out why. I'm back here with Jonna Spilbor, Law and Crime trial analyst. So why did the judge deny these motions, and what does it mean?
Yeah, so he denied them across the board, and he basically said that the burden was on the defense team because the defense was making the motion, and the judge ruled that the defense did not meet its burden to prove that the Garrity warnings had been violated. So all of the evidence that the defense camp wanted suppressed is going to come in. The trial will proceed full speed ahead. Might not be a good thing for this defendant, but that's the way the judge ruled. And Jesse, if we could just get real for a minute, you know, this judge is basically saying, whatever, if I made a mistake here, it's going to be up to the Court of Appeals to figure out, because he's in a courtroom with the family of a totally innocent 15-year-old kid who was shot dead. For him to have suppressed that evidence, I think a riot could have broken out. He wants to hear everything, let the jury decide, and if he screwed it up, the appellate court will fix it.
Are you saying judges just want to pass it down the line and don't want to be involved in this, Jonna?
I'm saying this is a very touchy and sympathetic case, and he's going to err on the side of the prosecution here.
It's interesting because he was not required to talk to the Dallas County Sheriff's Office, but he was required to talk to Bulk Springs. So once he signed that Garrity warning, it becomes very interesting about, well, did he have to speak to certain offices? Did he not have to? Is certain testimony tainted? Is certain testimony protected? At the end, this case is going forward, and we're going to have to see which way it goes. Jonna, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate your insight into this, and we can't wait to have you back to talk more about this case and other cases here on Law and Crime.
See you in the flesh on Monday.
Oh, I like that. That's great. Perfect. We'll have you in studio on Monday. Now, we're waiting, I think, for the live feed to come back. The jury is coming in right now. This is very interesting, the last, I would say, hour and a half or so about what's been happening here, because we've been watching the family members of 15-year-old Jordan Edwards, and that has been a very interesting thing to watch because this hearing was going on, and you have to think whether or not this case against the man who shot Jordan Edwards was going to continue. What was going on in their minds? Did they think that this would be able to go on? And it is. As Jonna said, that has been it would not have been a great idea for the judge to just dismiss this case or not allow significant evidence to come in. As we wait for the jury to come in and the trial to start up again, let's play one more time the body cam footage from Officer Gross of the shooting. You'll see how it all happened, and you can be the judge yourself about whether or not the defendant used excessive force. Take a look.